Lately, a number of prominent individuals have been sounding the drumbeat that we all must be living in a computer simulation, and that we are all simulated beings who are nevertheless unaware of our simulated nature. And for the most part, they've all been convinced by a single argument made by the Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom. I'll get to what his argument is in a moment, but first I want to address the response that many scientists have to this subject, that because the simulation hypothesis is untestable, it is thus not science, and so not worth having an opinion about. That's a fairly nihilistic view that I think actually reveals some unease with the subject. But more importantly, untestable questions are still worth answering, or at least worth attempting an answer to. After all, that's precisely how scientific paradigms change. Previously untestable hypotheses suddenly become testable. Okay, so with that out of the way, why is Bostrom's argument so compelling? Well, it has a kind of Kirk Cameron inevitability to it. With a series of nested propositions, the reader is guided to what seems like a single rational conclusion. It goes as follows. Either the probability that we ever could simulate consciousness is 0, or the probability that we ever would simulate consciousness is 0, or, since the number of simulated beings must outnumber real beings by many orders of magnitude, the probability that we live in a simulation is 1. Like Kirk Cameron's argument for why you should believe in Jesus, you're tested at each stage about your rational beliefs. And since most rational people have the same kinds of beliefs about these subjects, you're led down a path to an inevitable conclusion that you couldn't really avoid. But like Cameron's argument, Bostrom's statements are just too simplistic, and make some underlying assumptions that are easy to miss. And when we pick apart these assumptions, you can lessen the probability that we live in a simulation, but by the end of this video, I hope to demonstrate that the probability is actually 0. One counterargument that Neil deGrasse Tyson is fond of attacks a presumed hidden assumption of statement 2. That is, that if we use movies as an example of simulations that we do create, the number of movies we create that take place in time periods different from our own is dwarfed by the sheer number of movies that take place in our own time. And so, the argument goes, since simulating a universe with conscious beings in it is a capability that is firmly in our future, the probability that those simulations would be of our current time period is paradoxically low. I actually think this is a bad argument, because first it assumes things about the psychology of beings that would be running our simulation. It puts what we find entertaining into the minds of beings we really have no knowledge of. And second, it ignores the very glaring fact that movies generally take place in the current day, because it is fantastically easier to film the present than any other time. A movie director doesn't have to simulate the present. But if the entire universe is a simulation, then the constraints of money and difficulty evaporate, and the simulation could be really of any time period antecedent to the one where the simulation is turned on. We could alternatively examine how a rejection of statement 1 hides within it an assumption that simulated conscious beings don't know they're simulated. We might easily assume that, but what exactly are we basing that on? Because characters in movies don't know they're simulated? How do we know that a simulated consciousness wouldn't immediately recognize the falsity of its world and reject it? Proponents of the simulation hypothesis would probably just argue that any programmer worth his paycheck would program the consciousness not to recognize that. But that's already straining what consciousness even means in this context. If the answer to this argument is something close to an assertion that we're all dreaming and don't know we're in a dream, well, dreaming is definitionally not consciousness, so what's the point of the simulation? This isn't to say that one must take a position on the reality of consciousness, only that the premise of Bostrom's argument is that consciousness is a real thing and is worth simulating, so why bother simulating it if you're just going to change it at the first sign of it breaking your boundaries? Another counterargument hinges on the hidden Copernican principle at work in statement 3. That is, that we as neutral observers must be typical, and so if you've rejected statements 1 and 2, being a typical observer establishes you firmly in the category of simulated observers. Sean Carroll pointed out that if we're typical, and we're not capable of simulating anyone, then simulated beings must not be typical. The counter-argument to that is that you have to somehow stretch the Copernican principle across all time to even consider statements 1 and 2, since they're questions about the future, not the present. This is a very similar mind trap as the doomsday hypothesis. It goes that since it is unlikely that we are among the first humans to have ever lived on Earth, then the 50th percentile person has already been born. And if population growth continues as it has, humanity should go extinct in just a few hundred years, and that somehow the universe will intervene to make that happen, because otherwise we're all part of an exceedingly rarefied fraction of the first human beings that have ever lived. Something about applying the Copernican principle this way doesn't sit well. For one thing, anyone at any time ought to be able to apply the Copernican principle to themselves, And so if Ötzi could have done so, why didn't humanity go extinct thousands of years ago? Maybe the Copernican principle can't rationally be applied across the time axis. I don't really know, and fortunately, I don't need to for Bostrom's argument, because his entire premise as posed is a red herring. Bostrom's argument makes a conclusion about reality, and is a prediction of unreality. So we can boil it down to a simple flowchart. Is reality real? If you answered yes, I'd like to know how you know that. But if you're willing to entertain the possibility that the answer is no, the next question in Bostrom's line of thinking is, what is the probability that our unreality is a computer simulation? If you're willing to throw out the constraints of reality and physics, which you have to do to answer no at step 1, then literally any possibility you can imagine for how you might exist in unreality has some probability. Maybe you're a toy in a giant child's playset. Maybe you're a character in a book that a famous author is writing. Maybe we all exist in a universe conjured in a drop of water by a grey wizard high on hobbit leaf. Or maybe, and most probably, in an eternally existing and infinitely large universe of maximum entropy, a cloud of particles spontaneously converge to form a human brain. And in that brief moment, that brain, starved of all sensory input, imagined it lived on a planet with butterflies and cats, cake and oceans and snow and love and motorcycles and politics, music and war, moon landings and the color blue, and the feeling of forgetting your homework, and the feeling of falling asleep, and of anxiety, of contentment, of brevity, of fullness, of pain, of the earth shaking beneath your feet, of the rain falling on your face, trees that grow too tall, puppies that are too small, and all of the myriad things we experience in a life. And then that brain dissolved just as quickly. But in an infinitely large universe that has existed for infinitely long, this has happened infinitely many times. And so next to that possible unreality, what is the probability that all of this is a computer simulation? It's 0. Or maybe I'm just part of the program that wants you to think that.